And I'm holding here this wonderful reconstructed head of Cheddar Man. And now with DNA technology, we've got the whole genome of Cheddar Man.
One invader after another, each one sweeping away what came before. By the time history started being properly recorded, the original Britons had supposedly been wiped out. The English people of today were believed to be the descendants of centuries of European invasions and migrations. That was the story everyone accepted. But when scientists finally tested that story against actual DNA, the results came back completely wrong, because the invasions historians spent centuries describing as the destruction and replacement of the native population turned out to be something very different. Instead of disappearing, the original Britons stayed. Over time, they mixed with the newcomers and passed their DNA down through the generations. The people who were supposed to have vanished never really left. They had been there the entire time. So who were the ancestors of modern England really? And why did they survive when history claimed they had disappeared? Let's get into it. The test nobody expected. In 2015, a team of researchers from Oxford University, University College London, and the Murdoch Children's Research Institute in Australia published the results of a project called the People of the British Isles (POBI) study. It was, at the time, the most detailed genetic map ever produced for any country in the world. The methodology was careful. They collected DNA samples from 2,039 people across rural Britain. The key requirement was strict. Every participant had to have all 4 grandparents born within 80 kilometers of each other. This was the critical feature that made the study different from anything before it. Because a quarter of your genome comes from each grandparent. Participants were effectively providing a genetic snapshot of Britain as it existed in the late 19th century, before the mass migrations of the 20th century changed the population mix. These were people whose family trees had been rooted in the same patch of ground for at least 3 generations. They were as close to a genetic time capsule as you could get from living people. The researchers then compared those British DNA profiles against samples from 6,209 people across 10 European countries. Every population that had any documented historical connection to the British Isles was included. The goal was to see where British DNA actually came from, and whether the genetic fingerprints matched the historical record of invasions, conquests, and replacements. What they got back did not match the textbooks. Professor Peter Donnelly, who co-led the research at Oxford, said it plainly. It has long been known that human populations differ genetically, but never before have we been able to observe such exquisite and fascinating detail. The detail, it turned out, was full of surprises, the first of which was that the ancient Britons had never left. The Anglo-Saxon genetic contribution to modern English people averaged only 10% to 40% across most of England. In some regions, it was toward the lower end of that range. The majority of English ancestry came from populations that had been living on the island long before the first Saxon longboat crossed the North Sea. Historians had long described the Anglo-Saxon conquest in terms of displacement and replacement. But according to the DNA, it was more like a cultural takeover by a relatively small number of newcomers. They arrived, gained power, imposed their language, and intermarried with a much larger indigenous population that simply never went anywhere. The invasion story was not entirely wrong, but it was, in the most important sense, backwards. The story was about who took over. The DNA was about who stayed. The real question was whether this was a quirk of one study or was it the norm. And the deeper scientists looked at British DNA, the stranger and more complicated the picture became. The genetic map, one of the most striking things the 2015 study produced, was not a number, but an image. When researchers plotted the genetic clusters of British participants on a map, the result looked almost nothing like the political map of the United Kingdom. The genetic map ignored all of that. Instead, what emerged were clusters of genetically similar people whose boundaries aligned with something much older. Ancient tribal territories, geographic barriers. The natural divisions of the landscape had shaped where people could move and settle long before there were any written records. Central and southern England showed a striking internal uniformity. A large block of people who had been mixing and intermarrying for so long that the genetic differences within the group were minimal. But distinct clusters appeared at the edges, and the boundaries of those clusters did not follow modern county lines. They followed the old ones. The ones that existed before the Norman conquest, before the Viking incursions, before the Anglo-Saxons arrived. As Professor Mark Robinson, an archaeologist working on the POBI project, put it, the results give an answer to a question we had never previously thought we would be able to ask about the degree of British survival after the collapse of Roman Britain and the coming of the Saxons. The people of Cornwall, for example, carried genetic signatures linking them to Brittany in northern France. Consistent with documented accounts of migration across the English Channel in the early medieval period. The Welsh showed the strongest continuity with pre-Roman populations. The closest genetic links were to the hunter-gatherers who had walked Britain before farming even existed. Even within England, subtle regional differences told stories of ancient kingdoms that had faded from memory centuries ago. The genetic map was, in a very real sense, an archaeological site, and it was showing a picture of deep continuity that the written record had entirely obscured, but the clusters were only part of the picture. To understand what was really happening here, you had to go back much further than the Anglo-Saxons or the Romans, much further than any civilization that left a written record. Because the British were not a blank slate when the first invaders arrived. They were already the product of thousands of years of migrations that science is only now beginning to reconstruct. The first Britons. In 1903, workmen carrying out drainage improvements at Gough's Cave in Cheddar Gorge, Somerset, found a human skeleton buried in the cave floor. The man they found had died roughly 10,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. At that time, Britain was still warming from the cold that had driven most of its population south. He became known as Cheddar Man, and he was portrayed in museum reconstructions as pale-skinned, the ancient ancestor of the people who would eventually become the English. In 2018, researchers from University College London and the Natural History Museum sequenced Cheddar Man's entire genome for the first time. The reconstruction they produced stunned the public and the scientific community in equal measure. Cheddar Man had blue eyes, he had dark, curly hair, and he had skin that the research team described as dark to black. Chris Stringer, the Natural History Museum's research leader in human origins, described the moment plainly. To come face to face with what this guy could have looked like using cutting-edge science is a remarkable achievement. And from the results, quite surprising. According to Dr. Tom Booth, a postdoctoral researcher involved in the work, it was always assumed that humans quickly adapted to have paler skin after entering Europe about 45,000 years ago. Cheddar Man's genome showed that this assumption was wrong. Lighter skin pigmentation arrived in Britain much later than anyone had thought, carried in with the farming populations who began arriving from continental Europe around 6,000 years ago. Cheddar Man was not an outlier. He was a typical member of the population that had migrated into Europe from the Middle East after the last ice age. The first modern Britons looked nothing like the people who live in Britain today, and the scale of what came after them makes the Anglo-Saxon and Viking migrations look almost minor by comparison. About 6,000 years ago, farming arrived in Britain. It did not arrive as a set of ideas. It arrived as people, whole family groups crossing from continental Europe. Ancient DNA analysis published in 2019 showed that the transition to farming in Britain involved something close to a near-total population replacement. The incoming farmers carried ancestry that ultimately traced back to Anatolia, which is now Turkey. Within a few centuries, the people who had roamed Britain for thousands of years were gone. Not killed, most likely, but outcompeted and outbred. Today, only about 10% of the indigenous British ancestry can be traced back to those first Mesolithic inhabitants. Then the Romans showed up in 43 AD. By this time, the people of Britain were already a combination of at least 3 near-total population replacements, and the Romans would add another layer. But as the genetics would show, even that was not quite what historians assumed. 4 centuries of Roman rule, near zero genetic contribution. The people who had been there before them stayed. The next wave of arrivals would claim to have done what Rome could not. The DNA would tell a more complicated story. The Saxon contradiction. Contemporary accounts describe it as mass displacement. Native Britons fleeing west. Populations enslaved or exterminated. The old Roman cities falling silent. By the end of this period, the language spoken across most of what would become England was not Celtic, not Latin, but a Germanic tongue, Old English. The ancestor of the language you are listening to these words in right now. The scale of linguistic change made historians assume the scale of population replacement was equally dramatic. The written sources seemed to confirm it. The genetic evidence, however, told a more complicated story. The 2015 People of the British Isles study found that Anglo-Saxon ancestry accounted for between 10 and 40% of modern English DNA in the large Central and Eastern English cluster. The majority of ancestry came from pre-existing populations. This suggested intermarriage and integration rather than replacement. An elite takeover model. A relatively small number of migrants imposed their culture without displacing the underlying population. Then, in 2022, a second major study published in the journal Nature further complicated that picture. This one involved more than 70 researchers and ancient DNA from 460 individuals buried at early medieval sites across eastern England. They found something different. Up to 75% of ancestry, in some cases, came from continental northwestern Europe. These were not the genetic profiles of a small conquering elite. They looked more like whole communities of immigrants. Families, including men and women in roughly equal proportions, arriving and settling. So, which is it? Mass migration or elite takeover? The research community's current position is that both things happened, in different places at different times. The eastern coastlines and lowland areas saw the heaviest immigration. Migrants and locals intermarried over generations. The high percentages of continental ancestry in early Anglo-Saxon cemeteries gradually diluted as the centuries passed. That dilution had reduced the Anglo-Saxon contribution to the 10 to 40% range. Not a replacement. A blending. A permanent, irreversible mixing that produced a population that was neither purely native nor purely Saxon. Then came the Vikings, the great heathen army, the Danelaw. Thousands of Norse place names are still scattered across the English landscape, and in the DNA of the people living in those places today, almost nothing. The Vikings who vanished. The Viking army landed in East Anglia in 865 AD. The Danelaw, the region under Danish law and administration, covered roughly half of what is now England. The cultural impact of the Danish Viking occupation is visible in English to this day. The genetic impact is almost invisible. The 2015 Oxford study found no obvious genetic signature of Danish Viking occupation across the Danelaw region. None. The researchers wrote explicitly, "We see no clear genetic evidence of the Danish Viking occupation and control of a large part of England." A separate study published in the scientific journal Nature in 2020 sequenced the DNA of more than 400 Viking skeletons. It concluded that the genetic legacy of Vikings in the UK left the population with up to 6% Scandinavian ancestry. 6% across the entire country. The Orkney Islands, to the north of Scotland, experienced intense Norwegian settlement rather than Danish. They show a much stronger signal. Roughly 25% of Orkney DNA traces to Norwegian ancestors. The Norse Viking settlement of the Northern Isles was demographically significant. The Danish Viking conquest of the English Midlands was not. Why? The most likely explanation is the same pattern that appears throughout British genetic history. Military conquest and political control do not necessarily produce large-scale population replacement. The Danes who controlled the Danelaw were, in the end, a governing class, not a mass migration. They imposed their law and their language on towns and administrative districts. The farmers working the land around those towns were still the same people who had been there before the longships arrived. Their children did not stop existing because new rulers had moved into the fortified settlements nearby. What makes the Viking genetic finding particularly striking is the contrast with their cultural footprint. The language absorbed hundreds of Norse words that survive in English to this very day. The Vikings were there. They genuinely settled. And yet the DNA suggests their demographic contribution was minimal. Identity and ancestry, the research keeps showing, are not the same thing. You can adopt a culture entirely without sharing blood with the people who brought it. And then came 1066, the conquest that, by every account, transformed England more thoroughly than anything before it. The Normans rebuilt every major institution. They replaced the entire aristocracy. They introduced a new language into the courts and the church. They catalogued every acre of the kingdom in the Domesday Book. Surely this was the one conquest that left an unmistakable mark on the DNA. Conquering everything. But DNA. William the Conqueror defeated Harold Godwinson at Hastings on October 14, 1066. Within a few years, he had replaced virtually the entire Anglo-Saxon landowning class with his own followers. The Domesday Book was commissioned in 1085 to inventory the conquered kingdom. It recorded a country in which almost every major estate had changed hands. The new aristocracy spoke Norman French. The church was restaffed with Norman clergy. The architecture and the legal system changed. The written language changed. And yet, studies find that the Norman contribution to English ancestry is somewhere in the range of 1% to 5%. That figure is so small that it is difficult to distinguish from statistical noise in most analyses. The Norman army that crossed the Channel numbered in the low tens of thousands. The population of England at the time was somewhere between 1 and 2 million. The conquerors controlled the land, the law, the church, and the language of power. The vast majority of the actual people of England continued to exist and pass down their genes. Their descendants are still here. This is the pattern that the DNA keeps revealing across every conquest and every transformative moment in British history. Political power changes hands, culture shifts, language evolves, architecture transforms. But the people working the land, going about their lives at a scale too ordinary to be recorded by the chronicles, largely stay. They absorb the newcomers. They adapt to the new rulers. They survive. History, as it has been taught, is largely the history of the people who wrote it down. And the people who wrote it down were almost always the conquerors. They had every reason to emphasize the totality of their victory, to describe the people they replaced as gone, erased, swept away. The DNA simply does not cooperate with that narrative. The history in DNA. What the POBI 2015 study produced was something more unsettling than a correction to the history books. It was proof that the entire framework through which most people understand national identity and ancestry is built on assumptions. And in Britain's case, those assumptions crumbled when faced with the scientific evidence. There is also the question that the study raises about the written sources. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles that described Britons being exterminated or driven west were written by Anglo-Saxons. The Norman records that portrayed the conquest as a total transformation were written by Normans. These were accounts produced by the victors, for the victors, designed to legitimize power by emphasizing the completeness of their conquest. The genetic record is not subject to those pressures. It keeps a different kind of account, one written in molecular biology rather than political interest. And it has been sitting in the cells of the British population waiting to be read for over 1,000 years. That reading is still ongoing. The 2022 Ancient DNA study added significant complexity to the 2015 picture. Each new study refines the picture and, often enough, surprises the researchers who conducted it. The deep past of the British Isles is being reconstructed one genome at a time, and what it keeps showing is that the people who were supposed to have been replaced were rarely entirely replaced at all. The original Britons did not vanish. They are still here, mixed into the DNA of almost everyone living on that island today, carrying ancestry that stretches back to before farming, before writing, before any of the invasions that history decided were the defining moments of the place. The conquerors write history. The conquered carry the DNA. So, if history books and DNA tell different stories, which one should we trust more? Let me know your thoughts about this in the comments below. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more amazing stories like this one.